everybody, it's Matt the Dice Checker coming to you today with another installment of Let's Talk Genre. Now, it's been a very long time since I've come out with a video like this, and that's mainly due to some things going on at home with medical issues and such. But we're back, and for those of you who don't know, as a church organist, around the end of the year it gets really hectic for me. So I do appreciate all of you who've subscribed to the channel and all of you who've had a great deal of patience waiting for us to get the next video out. That being said, we did record a top 10 of 2022. There were some audio issues we went to go fix, but when you're doing a live stream, you just can't fix it. We will be redoing that top 10, and there actually might be some changes in mine because I've gotten a chance to play more games from 2022. That being said, let's go ahead and talk genre. So last week, we talked about perhaps one of the only genres out there that is actually in the fiction section, which is historical fiction. It has not been genreified elsewhere in the bookstore like the other genres we're going to talk about. So today we're going to talk about fantasy. Now, fantasy might be a bit of a longer video because there's a lot to go over. There really is so much to go over here. And of course, the big question is, where do the different areas of fantasy lie? I'm not going to tell you right now that I have all the right answers, but I'm going to tell you, as both the writer of fantasy and as a reader of fantasy, the different types I've found throughout my reading journey here. We might have a cat come in and knock things over. I know it's time to eat, folks, and he's a hungry little guy. So anyway, so let's talk about the different types of fantasies that are out there. And the first I want to talk about is the basic idea of what fantasy is. I'm going to find the definition for it here because, and I hate to be like, oh, Webster's dictionary defines fantasy as this. It's what we call speculative fiction that involves somehow magic or some fantastical element that might have ties with mythology. So everyone always talks about, and I'm going to pull it up right now. This is my copy of Lord of the Rings. Now, any fantasy reader, I believe, has read this or has at least seen the films. But there's a lot of, and that's the tale. There we go. There's a lot of things we could talk about with Lord of the Rings, and of course, there's full classes on Tolkien and all sorts of theories into his writing. But so many people actually say, "Oh, Tolkien is the grandfather of fantasy," and there's some truth to that. He's knocking the camera around now. Okay, there we go. You gonna sit still? You guys are still okay. There's some truth to the idea that Tolkien is the grandfather of fantasy, but there's a lot of, I wouldn't say lies, but misguided truths to that as well. Because when you think about it, a lot of people go, well, where did fantasy really begin? You could technically call all the mythological pantheons or any sort of mythology fantasy. Any story based around ancient Greece and the use of the gods in the text, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The gods are in that text. Creatures are in those texts. Technically, that's fantasy. You could even go as further back as something that couldn't be proven with science at the time and wasn't even considered science fiction. Bram Stoker's Dracula, while horror, some people could say is fantasy. So how large is this umbrella of the fantasy genre? And the answer is fairly large, but most have settled into two camps, and that is high fantasy and low fantasy. Now, there's a simple definition of this that I've discovered online, and there's a lot of argument behind it. And there's the more complex one. The simple definition that I've always heard is that, in general, low fantasy exists primarily in the real world without too many fantastical elements to it. Whereas high fantasy exists in a created world with many of the stereotypical types of creatures and magic that you see. And The more complex definition I've heard is high fantasy stems from, stems from, I'm probably going to get, oh, at this minute you're allowed when you cleared your throat. I'm sorry, okay? I can only do so much. I can either have a good microphone or a bad microphone. Which one would you prefer? Anyway, so high fantasy is any fantasy that has connections to previously established magical elements or epic heroic elements, such as things out of mythology. Either they be ancient or medieval types of mythology, and by that I'm throwing in the Arthurian legends. So, for example, a book like The Mists of Avalon could be considered by some to be high fantasy because it breaks in a bunch of those Arthurian elements that is attached to a medieval type of fantasy. But if we go upon the simpler definition, then The Mists of Avalon is a low fantasy story that's based more around the real world. So it's an odd little debate that I see online, and I've seen things tick back and forth. Some people quote Lloyd Alexander, maybe perhaps is the one who said low fantasy is the one that exists um, in the real world, and high fantasy has those fantastical elements in a world within itself. But I mean, it's such a difficult genre to define. So let's talk a little bit about it. Where does fantasy begin? The answer is we don't really know. We cannot pinpoint one particular author or one particular source and say this is where fantasy began. You could go all the way back to Beowulf. You could go back to the Odyssey. And you could even go back to the Arthurian legends and the mythology based around the Knights of the Round Table. Or you could just fast forward and you could talk about Tolkien, and you could talk about, what's the name of that guy? I'll get it. He wrote the long epic poem, one of the longest out there, I believe, called The Fairy Queen. And autocorrected to Gator Queen. Okay. There it is. Edmund Spear wrote The Fairy Queen, 1596. Let's see. It is, pretty much early modern English epic poem. Let's see here. Yeah, it's got that very Arthurian style to it. It's not an Arthurian legend book. I've always wanted to try and read it, but I've heard it's one of the more difficult books out there to read due to the Old English and due to its length itself. And so it's not the easiest thing you walk into a bookstore and find. So do we go back to there? I think the answer, as far as where do we cement fantasy, is during what I call the Tolkien era. We cannot just claim that Tolkien was the one who created modern fantasy. Because at the same time that Tolkien is writing Lord of the Rings, he's also friends with C.S. Lewis, who's working on Narnia. So, and I'm sure, before you at me, there are a ton of other people I'm forgetting in that whole line. So I do apologize for those other authors I haven't read yet. But we put so much emphasis on Tolkien, it's quite interesting to see what happens. Now, as time unravels and you get a lot of like the Conan the Barbarian stories, of which Robert Jordan of Wheel of Fame Time did write a few of those, you get a lot of the pulpy stuff that's fantasy. If you've played the game Defenders of the Realm, and I can't remember his name, and it's right there, it's just stacked under a bunch of other games. That style of artwork, the Hildebrand artwork. You have the Sword of Shannara books, or Shannara, however you want to pronounce it. It's up to you. Use your imagination. So where does fantasy explode and start to kind of split off into the highs and the lows? And I'm not going to debate about what high and low fantasy can become. So the Lord of the Rings kind of sets the idea of how do you handle your other world. You can either do what they call the hard magic system, and then the low magic, not the hard, soft magic system. Hard magic is when you explain everything down to a T. Think Brandon Sanderson with Mistborn, and how the metals work. Think Robert Jordan and Wheel of Time and how that magic works. You have a really clear understanding of how the world works. And then you have soft magic or even soft world building, where things are kind of vague, vague for the sake of the ease of the author sometimes. Where we have vague world building and soft magic, I would actually lump in Terry Goodkind's Sword of Truth into there. I would even put, what did I read recently? I don't know if I cared for it. Anyway, but things like that, where you're reading a book and you're like, okay, there's magic. How is there magic? Well, it's not really explained, at least in the first book. It's explained a bit more as time goes on. You could say that even parts of Harry Potter, the first book, have a soft magic system that gets explained as you go down the road. All right, so the big question that I think has been on everybody's minds for the longest time is, why is it separate from all the other sections in the bookstore? So we didn't have this problem with historical fiction, because historical fiction exists in the fiction section in your bookstore. Hey, hey, what are you eating? The cat is eating a plastic board game bag. All right, there we go. So, but when you look at fantasy, fantasy exists on its own, with a few exceptions, and it's mainly the exceptions of authors who have branched out. Stephen King wrote Eyes of the Dragon, which is more fantasy-based, and some can even say that Dark Tower is very much a dark fantasy, a telling of his universe. But those books exist. I got a piece of dust that's flying me around. Those books exist in the fiction section in your bookstore. They don't exist in the fantasy section. Now, some bookstores might put that in the fantasy section, but because Stephen King is an established fiction author, he's placed in the fiction area, so all his fantasy books are there as well. So if people want to read a Stephen King book and they don't know that it's fantasy, but they're going to give it a shot anyway, they go to that section. Everyone has been pushing for Tolkien to be put into the fiction section of the bookstore. I'm not really sure where I stand on it. Whether or not I think that fantasy belongs in certain parts of the regular fiction section. But what the bookstores are trying to do is tell the audience of that genre, here's where all of that stuff is. And that's why I think historical fiction gets away with it, because so many stories are unknowingly historical fiction. Even stories that are written in the modern day, if you read it, further down the line, somebody might, analyze it and say that it's historical fiction, when really it wasn't. It's just a piece of fiction written in the current time period. So fantasy kind of lies on that oddity of, it has its own section, and I think I agree that it should have its own section, because I don't read a lot of regular fiction. If I go to a bookstore and I want a fantasy book, I can go to the fantasy section and I can kind of parcel out what I want to look at here. But tell me your thoughts on the different types of fantasies. Now let's talk about more of the subdivisions of fantasy. You have mythological fantasy, which deals with an established mythology pantheon. You have they call it paranormal romance. That's where your Twilight falls under. Then you've got urban fantasy. Think the Dresden Files. Think Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Then you've got, of course, your high and your low that are like super high and super low fantasy. Your steampunk. Steampunk is its own thing. Now, where we have a lot of argument in the community is what is constituted as space opera. Because space opera does fall under the fantasy umbrella. Space opera is really where Star Wars belongs, right? Okay? Because at least for the original trilogy of Star Wars, it's how does the Force work? It gives a Jedi or Sith their power. Great. How? We don't know. All right, so there's that faith level that underlies it and that almost magical element to it. When you watch an episode of Star Trek and they want to get the Enterprise to move, they got to call like 5 different people at least to get the ship moving. All right? You got to call the helmsman and the engineer, and the first officer makes all the calls, and then we need coordinates, and then we got to go here and talk about why we need to go there, and then boom, they go. All right. Han Solo needs to start the Millennium Falcon. What does he say to Chewbacca? Punch it. So there is that level of, while Star Wars in space is science fiction-ish, because it has a lot of scientific elements around it, the explanation of those scientific elements aren't present. But when you're telling a grand story over multiple episodes, with great drama based around family dynamics and religious structures, like with the Jedi and the Sith, then I would say you do fall under space opera. So that's just one thing. Dune is odd. It settles in both of science fiction and the fantastical elements of it. So when you say it is space opera, it's a science fiction space opera. It's odd. Anyway. But tell me what your thoughts are about the fantasy genre as a whole and what we talked about here. Do you think it deserves to just be in the fiction section of the store and readers can kind of peruse and figure out if it's something they want to read? What are your definitions of high and low fantasy? I think everyone seems to have a different one, according to the internet. So, tell me what your thoughts are below. Thanks for joining me. And next time, we'll be taking a look at horror, which is a genre that has exploded recently in publications. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.